we now invite to initiate some continuity with what you've heard or some new lines of discussion.
This is what's called nepotism. This is rather an inchoate question rather than a comment, but there have been various moments in the discussion where I think it was Brandy Furr who brought it up, namely that there might be modernities other than the ones that were being talked about here. And so I guess the question I have is where is time? Where is time happening? So let's say postmodernism spent its time trying to get rid of the linear time, the teleological time of modernism. Then it seems to me that the issue of time has come home to roost with extraordinary power at this particular moment. All these books about what is contemporary art, what is contemporaneity, where is contemporaneity, or rather, I mean, my question is where is contemporaneity? So how, in other words, and this is really at the crux of it, is the narratives that we've been hearing, these very, very powerful narratives about the art of the period 75 to 95, how do these narratives intersect with what narratives might be told about what is sometimes called alternative modernities? How will these concepts be reimagined and transformed if it's possible to recognize that time might happen in places other than Europe and the United States?
I would just say briefly that one thing that is demanded by both Bourdieu and also globalization, by anything that prompts you to recognize a really pluralist state, or whether it's all those books on contemporaneity, is that there have to be, I mean, this is something everybody says, there have to be more than one history. And it's a different time at different places, and those times are intersecting and codependent, but they are not the same, so that the time has to be geographically specific, and that's back to the locality that Tom was asking for before. You have to say where your time is, and there are extensive discussions about this, in terms of Africa and when is Africa modern, and a lot of arguing about it. So I mean, the most sweeping answer would be when things get open to capitalism, then they become part of some larger time, but I think larger single time, but I think it's much more complicated than that.
Well, so Keith, you already know this example I'm about to give, but from my point of view, one of the dangers in those sorts of conversations, contemporaneities, where is contemporaneity, those sorts of texts, is the belief or the hope that there are contemporaneities easily to be found in quote-unquote unusual places. And by easily, for example, I would mean I just got an email of the announcement for the Tbilisi Triennial that Henk Slager in Utrecht is going to put together. And having just been there a few months ago, I know the kind of UFO appearance of that Biennale is going to constitute in that place. So this example, which you know before, it's not a modernist example, but it encapsulates, for me, the kind of debates that go on. That was Verflin's Principles of Art History translated into Chinese in 1998. And this was in Hangzhou, and I happen to know the person who translated it. And it's led to some interesting disagreements over the years since then. The disagreements are about the nature of the reception of this text. And basically, people have said to me, Terry Smith is one of them, that it would be great to find that to go there and see how the text is being received, because it'll be received in wonderful, unpredictable ways. I'm sure it is, but having been there at that moment, my experience was that the hope was that on the part of the translator and the instructors was that it was going to be received in a very, very serious, unironic, straightforward 1914 way, so that they could build their art history on Western models. So that, to me, that emblematizes a lot of the problems of perception in the issue.
Yeah, there certainly are, I think, forces that the international art market, including the activities of nonprofit institutions, are exerting that, are eroding what might be, truly alternative modernities in relation to a relatively homogeneous one. I don't know who else felt like this, but at the New Museum Triennial, which was a global enterprise, it was really, if you didn't read the wall labels, it was almost impossible to intuit where any individual work came from. They seemed to belong to just the same network of expectations of how you make art, or what art should look like, or what it should address in terms of experience. I can't think of a significant deviation that you could actually tie to a particular resistant place and time on exhibit in that whole show. And you could of course say, well, that's the New Museum filtering, but I think that there's reciprocity there between the producers and the curators.
I just wanted to take a quick whack at the question, and Mr. Yu, but I do think this is really simple, but there is a way in which faith in political revolution was displaced onto a hope for artistic innovation, was displaced onto desire for theoretical innovation. I mean, there is a way, I think, in which the critical theory of this period did operate as a last avant-garde. And so there was a progressive sense of temporality, Keith, to which it subscribed, I think. And one effect was that its rhetoric was very much avant-gardist in the sense of everything was about a break, rupture, coupure. It was the end of this, that, and the other thing, the end of painting. This is a crimp text we could have read. There seems to me to be a shift now, and I see this as a sanguine turn, which is a shift towards narratives of persistence. I mean, sometimes in the register of the traumatic, the aftermath, the afterlife, this, that, and the other thing, but there's also a sense now of different kinds of continuities, multiple continuities. And I think that's actually a very good thing for the discipline. But it's foreign, I think, to the critical theory of this period. I mean, in a way, if Derrida was one avatar, that moment, hoary figures like Warburg are with us again now. And that turn, in a sense of temporality, really interests me.
Well, at the end of a long day, we received many challenges here, but there's one thing that puzzles me. 75 to 95, right? I wasn't here part of that time, but this panel and the things you're addressing do not remind me of the America I thought of at that time. You didn't put geography onto this. In the beginning, someone said Western. It's clear now at the end of the day that we're talking about Anglo-American criticism, right? 3 Frenchmen sneaked in, but 2 came in for heavy criticism. It's made because it was to the extent that they were anglicized, right? But at the end of the day, I'm surprised at the lack of diversity. And I love David's talk on Coben. I thought that was, and I don't say that rhetorically, I mean it sincerely, it was beautiful. But what stands out for me is that Coben wasn't here to represent himself. And we are still, the institution of art history is still exclusionary. It's still about conferring value in Bourdieu's sense and creating mechanisms that consecrate our own kind, our institutions. Yes, we're still in the business of speaking for others. And brandishing Foucault at every top and speaking about others, but the others at the end of the day are not there. So I'm wondering how, when you put this together, if you thought about that, and how you criticize your own panel from this point of view.
Could I just say something, Esther? I invited
Could say,
Coben
I hate to, I mean, it's a perfectly legitimate observation, and it has occurred to me. The Mercer text came into the repertoire a little later in the day, and when the number of panelists had already been invited and accepted. And we hadn't actually wanted to emphasize text by the participants. So the text, I guess you could say, was here in his stead, but there's certainly a legitimate objection to his not being able to respond to his own text. I agree. Was he? Yes. Oh, you tell me that.
Well, Michael did invite Kabana, so that he couldn't come, yes.
Indeed, but you have a long association with some great critics, Chica and so forth, and of course they weren't writing at the time, I understand that, but they were issues that we could have brought up, even if they weren't here.
Yeah, well, as I say, I'll just take the brunt of this and, say that the balance was incomplete. But with every gesture of balance, if it's done for that reason, there'll be a further one for which we could have been taxed. But maybe we stopped one or two too soon.
Could I just say, I don't think the point, well, my point anyway, wouldn't be to be critical of the organisation of the panel. I know there's a serious point about diversity of composition of groups and so on and so forth. But if I have a problem, it's not to do with the composition of the panel as such, it's been to do with the relative restriction of what it is that we've talked about, which has been, as you say, Anglo-American, largely. And that is something that we could have sort of collectively gone beyond, I think. And the fact is that we've continually sort of come back to a particular range of issues which clearly exercise people, because that's what coming back to them means. But I do agree that the sense of circling back to a range of issues on hours on end is quite remarkable when you think of what there is out there and indeed was out there in that period that we're supposed to be looking at. So I do take the point, although I don't want to be critical.
It's easy to say, and we had one day, and I think I would go back to my comment about at least taking care of your own local competences. That is to say, being able to speak from your own experience and your own levels of learning. Rather than assuming responsibility for others. I think a lot of this might fall under the stricture, first voiced as speaking for others. If you're not a steward of your own inheritance, in a way, what do you have to contribute? There'll be other occasions and other events to supplement this particular topic. It was meant to address a peculiar and particular time and place to the best of our ability over a relatively short span of time to ask for the earth in a literal and figurative sense from this exercise, I think would have diluted what we really set out to accomplish.
Do you have a rebuttal that you...
No, I disagree with my old friend Tom here. I think that we can't say, oh, this wasn't speaking for others, or I think these things should have been addressed because of America, what was happening at the time there, and the rise of the women, the AIDS, the continuing importance of the rise of the African Americans, the civil rights, at the time of Thatcher and Reagan. I think these are important things, Tom. I'm surprised to hear you take that point.
I'll stand by it.
Just briefly, before the next question, I mean, if you guys do manage to publish a book out of this, God knows how that would happen, but if you did, by the time it appears, it would be 20 years since the end of the period, and it's a 20-year period, and it's in the nature of history to condense, distill, forget, and shouldn't be an object, itself shouldn't be an object of mourning, so.
Hi, thank you so much, first of all. I was just wondering, it struck me, we've been talking so much about how and what it meant to write art history and about art during a particular period, a particular historical period, and by extension, how to write about art right now. And the historical period really precludes or starts before the kind of apotheosis of the internet, which was kind of briefly alluded to. But I was wondering, you know, at this particular moment when it feels like, as Professor Jackson pointed out, there's so much information available that it almost feels like it's a sorting process or a searching process as opposed to an uncovering process, or that certain maybe hard-won insights, such as the kind of performativity of identity, or even the kind of interconnectivity of you know, various geographical regions, feels almost intuitive or self-evident, how that might inflect some of the conversations today.
I think, I guess it was Jonathan's characterization of Matthew's persona as both, both meaning it and being ironic simultaneously might speak. I mean, I do feel this is a certain kind of generational issue, that to be in the wake of postmodernism to such an extent that these doctrines have been, as you said, internalized. Raise questions about, you know, if, I mean, this would be Latour's point to a certain degree, that perhaps some of these strategies have lost their teeth to a certain degree, and that in this new terrain, you know, a different mode of conviction or a different mode of critique is necessary, which isn't to say that critique doesn't continue to exist, but it will take on a form that might be unrecognizable from its previous manifestation.
It's funny because that relates precisely back to my, and this was just a knee-jerk reaction to the preceding point, was that my immediate reaction was, it's far from obvious to me that being included on the stage is a good form of inclusion. It could be that being excluded from this situation is actually the most productive form of inclusion. It's just not obvious that the power structures that supposedly bestow power, discursive power, are really the ones who are bestowing it. I mean, very frequently you have collapses of regimes that seem impregnable, and that's probably happening now.
Would you consider the audience dubious too?
No, I don't think that we're dubious, but I think that it could be that we're dubious. It's not obvious to me that inclusion is a good, and that frequently one pursues a non-inclusion because it creates possibilities that would be occluded through inclusion. That was just a knee-jerk reaction. It's not a worked out thought. It's just funny that I thought that immediately.
And, can I?
Oh, well, I just wanted to return briefly to the issue that Esther raised, and just to say something about put it in a little bit broader perspective maybe, because I think that one thing that I've learned from participating in this, or something that I've been made aware of, is that this is a moment in which this period is the history is being written. I mean, it's a kind of moment in which PhDs are being developed, which will give an account of the period. It's a moment in which exhibitions are being done, thinking of the exhibition that Helen Molesworth has curated in Chicago, which is opening around now. And I think it is a moment for your words really to be heard, not only about a particular panel or one afternoon's opportunity to think about this, but actually for me and my own teaching and reflection, to think about what will be written, what will be done by way of exhibitions, what postmodernism will we have, and what is the process by which through institutional as well as individual reflection that will be produced. So I kind of wanted to elevate your question a little bit beyond the simply an address to this event, which of course is very important, but also just to say on my own behalf that that the role of feminism, politics of subjectivity, the AIDS crisis, the end of the Cold War, the way that all of these things bear upon the current moment, and for me also crucially right now, the militarization of everything, including the academy, how those play into the writing of the history of the period, who will do it, who will be included, who will have voice. All those things I think we've been asked to be alert to by this event. So for me that's been the positive, but I just wanted to thank you for the question that you're raising.
Oh, go ahead.
Can I just say something briefly? In a way, I think both these questions are very important, and both exercised me thinking actually about what we're doing. But the question about the internet and the rise of the so-called digital age, I think is also important because it obviously overlaps with the period that we're discussing, although the period we're discussing, most of it seems kind of an innocent time before the ways in which our lives have so radically transformed. And I think the question of to what extent can you avoid or ignore certain subsequent radical kind of changes in experience and what we conceive of as knowledge and how knowledge distributes in the world, because obviously the way knowledge distributes itself in the world, the kind of circuits by which it does that have changed so radically. But also the question of what knowledge is, this is a very simple kind of simplistic rather point, is that when you can get information, so-called knowledge at the press of a button, where does thinking go? And for me, it does raise very fundamental questions about thinking and what it means to think, how that relates to the kind of information we seem to be able to get so easily, but also wanting to resist the kind of technophilia that also I find kind of surrounds me in terms of some of the critical debates about art that we haven't actually been voicing this afternoon, but certainly in my other experience outside, that kind of preoccupation with the technological and with new technologies is absolutely everywhere. And, to what extent can one pretend that's not there?
And I just wanted to, offer very briefly a quick shout out to the guy who actually lives inside my head, Ross Chambers. And one of the things that Ross Chambers argues is that there are two predominant modes of irony, and irony is the mode of resistance. And one of those is the irony of appropriation, and the other is the irony of negation. And you have to tease this out, as I'm offering the sort of thumbnail version, but essentially, negation, ironic negation, depends upon knowing where power comes from. And so you can negate it. And appropriation is the form of resistance when power is diffused and decentered. And what I've been finding that I just want to comment on is that it seems to me that we've been curiously moving from a moment of ironic appropriation to a moment of ironic negation at the very moment that electronically and otherwise, power is more, one would expect, diffuse than ever before. And I don't have an answer to that. I'm still chewing on it, but it's, I thought, worth noting.
I have a very small point to make, but one which increasingly, as the day went on, became more important to me, and perhaps not to anybody else, is that the period under discussion, 75 to 95, is indeed a very lively period in art history in Germany, and critical theory is, of course, something which is homemade in Germany and has a long tradition, in particular also then with the exchange of colleagues in East Germany. But what happened is that many of those people who were involved in a very, very, very strong and violent debate in the late 70s and early 80s moved on to other shores, and there's a far less strong sense of melancholy at the moment in Germany than in the Anglo-American world. And I think there's one very, very small reason for that, and that is that German scholars have continuously engaged with what was produced in England or America or in France, but the reverse is not true. So we can have debates, this is perhaps a stupid point about has Lacan used the word the self as if he's written in English, but of course he hasn't. And I think this is crucial and important. And it matters, I guess, that increasingly we, at least in France and in Germany, and if I might only speak for those two countries, notice that there has been a change in both countries, a policy change about language teaching, which I think is to the detriment of intellectual development.
Oh, thank you. Irony is a sort of the spark for this question, or what I hope will eventually coalesce into a question. I wanted to start, though, with what Rob had said, or had suggested, or asked, I guess, whether some of the strategies of post-structuralism or postmodernism had lost their teeth. And you mentioned the Bruno Latour critique in that connection. And I think that when those strategies are caricatured in the way that he does, that the critique of authority is called conspiracy theory. And when we confuse, relativity with relativism, yes, it's very easy to claim that they've lost their teeth or lost their relevance. And so this idea of caricature as a strategy, as a way of gaining power, I think is interestingly linked to this idea of irony and ironic appropriation. So here's the question I have. The notion of ironic appropriation, while I can sort of conjure this pretty easily in terms of the visual production of the period under question today, I wonder if any of the participants might want to talk about the use of play or humor. Obviously, I think Matthew is giving us a demonstration, a performance of sorts. Boris Groys, Slavoj Žižek, they also, I think, are using a similar mode of kind of a rhetorical strategy and a kind of negotiation of power that also involves play. And in thinking about, of course, the importance of Derrida, right, for much of post-structuralist thought, I just wonder if this idea of play is germane to the texts in the way that it seemed to have been germane to the visual manifestation of postmodernism. I would just say that it's there in the way the artists talk. So, like some of the artists that would go with the idea of subversive complicity in Hal's essay at the same time are doing, the way they're talking is like a parody of theory or a parody of not being able to be located, and there are round tables and stuff like that from the time where that's really the dominant mode. And the second text, which I offered but didn't get chosen for today, was by Albert Erlin, who has a very sophisticated, I think, ideas about history, but also is so bound up with an unlocatable position and a sense of irony when dealing with ideology. So I think it's a quite common strategy for artists. I don't know if someone else wants to do for the critics.
Just very, very quickly, I think it's a terrific question, but I think there's play and there's play. I mean, play, it's a great aesthetic concept, of course, Spielraum, space for new imagination. And I think, that's a possibility, obviously, in art, but also in critique, one hopes. But what I see, you mentioned Zizek and others, Matthew perhaps, I think we do live in a time of discursive play but not play in the Schillerian sense, but play in the sense of paradox. There's a way in which I think comedy is our form, and there was a way in which everything is more or less comedy central. And it's a play with paradox, with parable, with pun. And this speaks not only to Zizek, but many others, Greuze, Butler too often. And for me, it's symptomatic of a time that's profoundly stuck, that can only invert, reverse, go topsy-turvy, but not really get anywhere. For me, it's a discourse that purports to be post-dialectical, but is somehow pre-dialectical. And that, I think, we're a little bit stuck in this conversation, too. But, that's just one reason.
So I offer that we move to wine then. So I wanted to thank all of you and thank all of our participants and conveners.